And now we present to you Thac0 with Advantage.
Welcome to Thac0 with Advantage. We're two friends have been playing D&D a long time. While both of us love lots of other RPGs, D&D gives us puppy eyes from our bookshelves if we don't pick it up and play with it once in a while. Hi, I'm Ange, and I am rapidly approaching having been playing role-playing games for 40 years. I'm not sure how to process that amount of time, but let's just say I'm going to continue to write and talk about role-playing games for the foreseeable future. Check out Gnome Stew.
Hi, I'm Jared. Gnome Stew. What do I know, Jared.com. We can talk more later. It's cool. After we look at the games we're running in the campaign journal, we'll be talking about the benefits of good representation in our games. Then we'll have some recommendations of D&D related content for you to check out in our downtime research
Stand by for station identification. This is WD&D the Role Player. Now we're going to McElroy McKinney and the Bardic College.
My. The art of Dungeons & Dragons has been foundational to capturing the imagination of many of its fans. But the art of art direction hasn't always been one of D&D's strong points. In the Greyhawk setting, the Becklunchish people were referred to as having golden-hued skin. The Kandathians and the Forgotten Realms, who make up a significant portion of the population of the Heartlands of the Forgotten Realms, are described as having olive skin. Now, early D&D described mountain dwarves as having deep brown skin, and the Turami people of the Vilhon Reach, a major trade hub of Faerun, I might add, are described as having dark skin and tight curly hair. But if you look at the artwork of early D&D elves, dwarves, gnomes, halflings, and adventuring humans, they were almost always fair-skinned, with most people of color and artwork representing native people of exotic lands that the adventurers go to from their homes. This wasn't a specific failure of the art department. It was the failure of the 80s and 90s to realize that your default artwork can't assume that everyone in a fantasy setting has traditionally white features. D&D 3rd edition may have been a bit of a turning point. So Redgar, the iconic fighter, he was actually meant to be a person of color, but management wanted him to be unambiguously white. So the design team and art department constantly conspired to make Redgar the character that was setting off traps, getting blown up, poisoned, and generally on the edge of death. Only seems fair.
Let me just finish up this campaign journal.
Since we last talked, I have been able to play Jared's Maroni game! Yay! He'll talk about that, though. In my other games, we have had 2 sessions of the Old Margrave, played a session of City of Cowls, and I was able to restart the Victoriana campaign. With Old Margrave, we had 1 session that was mostly downtime. I have been struggling with my energy this winter, as I'm sure most people have, but I still wanted to make sure they got to do some cool stuff and downtime shenanigans, and to get Grish set up for getting his fancy sword enchanted now that he had a pile of gold. For downtime, I like to use A Life Well Lived by Cubicle 7, but the most important part was, as I said, Grish trying to find somebody to enchant his sword. This was the incredibly well-made sword he had received in the very first adventure for rescuing a blacksmith's lost daughter. He eventually found Oscus Tallson weapons and armor in the gear district of Zobek. I had fun describing Oscus as the beefiest halfling you've ever seen. Little man made of muscle jumping up on top of his anvil to stand eye to eye with the PCs and be like, what do you need? They discussed prices, and when Oscus kind of picked up on the fact that Grish was going to spend every single gold, silver, copper to his name to pay the price for the enchanting, he offered a deal. He would charge half the price if they would go find his lost shipment of Mithril. This was basically me putting together an encounter for an episode that was mostly individual downtime. So they called the group together and went off on a hunt for the hijacked Mithril, which had them going down into the sewers and finding some ghouls from the Ghoul Empire that roam the Underdark. And in addition to a bunch of regular ghouls, I also threw them up against a pair of ogre ghouls and a big copper slime thing. It was a fun fight, and I think they had fun even if they smelled bad after they were done. The next session of Old Margrave began with the next official adventure in the Old Margrave book. This one has them getting a sending, asking them to come to Rivensky Brewery because there was somebody there that wanted to hire them for a dangerous job. When they showed up, they were introduced to LaShark, a talking house cat who claimed to be a transformed griffin. I actually had a lot of fun with this bit. She was basically hiring them to go rescue her eggs from the goblinoid brigands that had attacked the old Griffin Tower she and her pride lived in. My players were amused by this, and of course, they accepted the job. They could have gone about it a few different ways. They actually would have been able to do a frontal assault. There's like 30 goblinoids, goblins, hobgoblins, some bugbears, some goblin captains out front, and then there's various other lieutenants and higher ups inside the tower. And I don't know, they could have taken it. They've got Fireball available to them now. Maybe only one shot of it, but they still got Fireball available. But they ended up deciding to go the sneaky, stealthy route, and they found the secret entrance, which was guarded by a couple of shambling mounds. In the book, it's only one shambling mound, but that's like, these are my players in this game. They mow through stuff if I give them what's actually written in the book. Unless, of course, they do like they did in the Bramble King and just charge in without any tactics and pull the entire location to them. But even then, they'd still handled it. Anyway, they found the secret entrance in the basement, which let them in, and then inside there, they found the secret access to the hidden library, which will let them circumvent all of the fights with the goblinoids in the tower on the way up. So we stopped there, because one of my players had to go pick up a car at the airport at 6:30 a.m. the next morning so he could drive to Boston before the snowstorm hit. So I'm like, we're calling it at 11. It's your guys at a good stopping point, and we'll just pick it up from here the next time. In City of Cowls, we finally are back in Indus. We caused a bit of a stir by basically magically appearing in the middle of the Kraken's Maw, but bringing supplies to the stranded folk there also brought some hope. It's like the big damn heroes are back. We learned that some of our friends were out and about in the city trying to hunt down the Ebon Cowl who had killed Jan Gerritsen. Jan is a character from Dove's history who came to the city and ended up going against her father's wishes to let her be and became a part of their cohort in the city. We discussed what we were going to do for a little bit. It was getting very close to the point of Ange starting to get itchy and wanting to make things a now problem. But eventually we decided to go out into the city and clean up some of the devils that had been stalking the Kraken's Maw to see if there were any weaknesses to get into it. Because way back in the history of the campaign, when Elric got access to the spell Hallow, he hallowed the Kraken's Maw in honor of his god Kord. So it's a drinking establishment. It is protected against all things fiendish. Anyway, we got out in the city, we dealt with some devils there, and then we went looking for our friends that were hunting the cowl. We found them, made a plan for what we were doing, and then we headed to the docks to help clear them for the fleet of Northmen that are basically sailing up the river right now to land in the city and help us fight the devils. In that fight, the Ebon Cowl showed up with some of his assassins. The fight went pretty easy, but I don't think it was as easy as some people think, because what happened is the Ebon Cowl tried to cast Feeble Mind on Modron, our celestial warlock, and he would have succeeded if I hadn't have been able to use some wild magic shenanigans to give him a D4 to his saving throw, which let him not suffer from feeble-minded, which is pretty nasty. It drops your int and your charisma to 2 for the foreseeable future. The funny thing is Modron also had this spell, so on his turn, he immediately turned around and cast it on the Ebon Cowl and succeeded, at which point Anu reached out, ripped the cowl off, and amazingly made the charisma save to avoid being taken over by the artifact. Because, as I suspected, the Ebon Cowl was not the person wearing it, it was the artifact itself. Because the person under it was just this old beggar that we'd seen around the city before. I had suggested this was what was going on once we heard the cowl was active again, but I had also been watching Campaign 4 of Critical Role, and the concept was at the forefront of my brain. I am very excited to ask the GM when the campaign is fully over if that had been the plan from the beginning, or if it was one of those, oh, the player just said something really cool, I'm going to roll with it. Either way, we probably have 1 or 2 more sessions left in that campaign. We will be playing soon, and I'm not sure if we'll get to Asmodeus in the next session, but it's coming very soon. With Victoriana, we were finally able to schedule to get back together, because that game is in person, rather than online. And I started the next adventure in Dreadful Inquiries. This is an interesting one. I really like the ideas in it, but it has a lot of tangled threads that prove the point that it isn't always easier to run a pre-written adventure. I've had to do a lot of work to make sure I understand what's going on and which clues lead where and how to get the players through this convoluted mess to the end point. I don't want to give any spoilers away because, this is still something that's coming out for everyone, but it's convoluted. I like it, but it's hard to run. But that's where we're at.
It's funny because when you're talking about that, asking the GM if they got that from Critical Role or whatever, there was something, and I cannot remember what it was, but there was some encounter where Abria was like, I'm going to wait until everyone forgets about this encounter, and I'm going to steal it for one of my games.
I don't think the GM for City of Chaos watches Critical Role, and he has been working on this campaign for over a decade.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if this is something he has had in his back pocket for a while, because he has done a lot with artifacts in other campaigns. In fact, in the previous campaign, The Ladies of Fazdal, my rogue, Z, had a special artifact called Ethne's Skein, which was a hiltless dagger that was a sentient artifact that thrived on recklessness. And if it got too bored, it would just leave you. It was very exciting because basically when we ended that campaign, I survived the collapsing wizard tower by surfing the sacrificial stone table out of the collapsing rubble. I basically got a nat 20 on my acrobatics check to survive this fall. And at the end of it, he had Ethne's Skein basically go, "That was amazing! See you later!" and then just disappear from Z's possession. In the current campaign, we ran into a character that is the current possessor of Ethne's Skein. And it was like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. I know what that is. That's awesome.
It was really funny because I had a Star Wars game that I was running, and the week after the session, something would happen on Rebels that was almost exactly like what I just did. And I was like, it's obvious I'm not copying this, but at the same time, this is weird, guys.
That's funny.
So it has been so long and we've had so many cancellations and everything. I forgot that I actually have a session to talk about until I noticed Andrew's notes. So we're going to revisit our PCs and the Siege of Chimyrus. And last time around, I mentioned, the whole thing that we're doing. If you're interested in that, listen to the last episode because you should always listen to back episodes anyway. But at the end of that game session, the PCs found the lair for Arush Vadula, who is the Red Dragon general that is assigned to Chimyrus. And the encounter that we're going to play through was the paladin ally of theirs, hunting down the dragon so that he can deal with her and cut her off from her troops. So essentially the way it was set up, the paladin is on his griffin in one corner of the map. The PCs are where they entered the scene at the bottom of the map. There are 4 huge magma elementals that are guarding this area, and essentially they just had to make sure that the paladin got through and then not die. I will freely admit, my brain has forgotten half of what went on during this. I know that the griffin had gotten hit with one of the magma balls, and it took it down past bloodied in one shot. And then the paladin had to use his lay on hands to keep the griffin up in the air, and it got hit one more time, and it was real close to not staying in the air, but it managed to keep going and made it to the other side of the map. I know that our Ratatosk Bard turned into something large and impressive, and I cannot remember for the life of me what it was, other than that it was really funny that one of the elementals did their thing where they open up a chasm that you can fall into, and the Bard fell in as an impressive animal and came back out as a Ratatosk Bard. The elementals also had this huge radius earthquake ability, and I actually did not roll a bunch of recharges for that. It was just that there were 4 of them, and 3 of them got to set them off, and it was doing some nasty stuff to everybody.
Yeah, Kazina was lucky because she's a rogue, so deck saves means if she succeeds, she takes nothing. If she fails, she takes half. And we had Ivy flying, so she was avoiding the worst of it, which thank God, because otherwise she would have been toast.
She was avoiding the worst of it, but I think she still got hit more than she has in a lot of fights
Yeah.
in this one, because once she was up in the air, they were just throwing magma balls at her, so she was still catching a little bit up there. So
Yeah.
it was, I mean, it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was the hardest fight you guys have had, but it wasn't a cakewalk either.
No, definitely wasn't a cakewalk. There was definitely, I think, both Marin and Karatatup both went down at least once.
Which gets a little nerve-wracking because, like, your Bard is your primary healer in that, you know, like, I know Ivy is sort of a healer, but she also likes to save her spell slots for, like, throwing ridiculous spells at things, too.
I mean, she doesn't hesitate to heal. She's no jester.
And also, we had a few crits flying around in that fight, too, which, once you're talking about, like, 14th level characters and, you know, CR 14 monsters, crits start looking really nasty when they happen.
I think Xena got, was it 80 points in one hit that was a crit?
So I was pretty happy with that. I know a lot of high level 2014 play could feel like it was very easy for high level characters to walk through. That is one thing I think Kobold Press did a really good job of, is having higher level monsters that hit a lot harder than some of the Wizards of the Coast monsters did.
Yeah.
And I definitely think they fixed a lot of them in the 2024 monster manual as far as making some of them a little nastier in the official stuff, but definitely the Kobold Press stuff kept pace a little bit better at those higher levels.
Yeah, it's one of those, it's a little bit of a conundrum for game designers, because at that level, at that 14th, 15th level area, you want to feel like the big damn heroes, you want to feel like superheroes, but at the same time, you need stuff to challenge you. So.
Yeah, you want your huge magma elementals to at least, even if you're a superhero, a huge magma elemental should be a little bit of a threat.
Yeah.
The PCs performed a few more of our skill-based missions to keep the siege of Chimyrus going on. One of the things that they did was they freed the palace, which was the major hub of operations for government, which was a big turning point. I believe our point total is at the place where you can't lose, you can just only get a decent victory or a really good victory, which is really going to determine how many reinforcements Glavistus has when you have that final confrontation with her. And I think you might still be on the cusp of, you could get a draw, but you're really close to going over into the you're going to win this fight. But the PCs also hit another one of our set pieces that happens during the fight when they take certain options. And after scouting out the mercenaries, which are a band of giants, they find out from their friend, who was the doppelganger, that they convinced the entire mercenary company was Loki's child. Their doppelganger friend shows up really messed up and mangled and says that he's found out who the Chosen of Loki is, which is a mystery that we've had going on for a while. The person that we assumed, I know who it was. I'm running the game. But the PCs had assumed at first it might have been the leader of the mercenary company that was just a real jackass, and found out, nope, wasn't him. Turns out that it is the very quiet, mild-mannered professional chaplain that is the Chosen of Loki, and her entire gambit here was to make sure that the company had their greatest victory, at which point she could ruin that great victory and prove that life is completely pointless. They finally looked like they were going to do something momentous, and then they will fail, and that is exactly what Saint Othkitel, the Twice Slain, is all about. Loki resurrected this guy that died a stupid death. He lived for another year and then died another stupid death. And that is exactly the energy that she is trying to capture by turning on Edeltrod, who is the mercenary leader.
And we are going to stop her.
We are going to open up on them tracking down Chaplain Carlina and hopefully stopping the Chosen of Loki from causing this horrible thing to happen.
Yes.
So that's where our session ended, and someday we may have another session to resolve this.
Yeah.
2026 has been real rough for scheduling stuff.
Our Eldritch Invocation. We've got a Patreon to help us keep doing this show. In addition to keeping the lights on, we also provide additional content meant to help make your games better. We've recently posted exploration and adventure design tips, improvisation and flexibility tips, alternate XP award rules, and ancestor origin feats for D&D 2024. We'd love it if you'd join us and help support the show. Oh, we also have a Discord that anyone can join, so come on over and have a chat. You can find the Patreon at www.patreon.com/Thac0WA.
Welcome to the Dungeon Master's Workshop.
Moving on into the Dungeon Master's Workshop, we've covered the ups and downs of diversity in D&D back in episode 57, but we were asked by one of our listeners to cover how to maximize the benefits of good representation in our D&D-esque games. So let's dive into expanding this topic. As I said, we covered a lot of this in episode 57, but just to touch on it here, why should we be concerned with promoting diversity in our games?
So at this point, we have had decades of certain ethnicities, gender presentations, and sexualities being presented as the default. And we need to do the work to make sure that that default is not falling on a group of people that isn't representative of the people that are at our table. We need to make sure that people are feeling included and that they understand that we know that they belong at the table and that they belong in the game.
Even if you could make an argument that the dominant percentage of players of role-playing games is a certain thing, it is a very diverse group that is actually playing these days. And you want to make the space welcoming. I want more people to play our games. I want more people at our tables, just in general, all over the place. And you can do that just by making it not hostile, by avoiding certain tropes and stereotypes and such things that kind of, we talked about like Oriental Adventures in the previous episode and how it was probably very well-meaning by the people who wrote it, but it was still not a good representation of the cultures it was trying to transplant into D&D. And that's because it was done completely without people who were from those real-world cultures that they were trying to represent in D&D.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I work at a school district, and people assume things when you start talking about those defaults, and when people have those defaults locked in their head, sometimes they are very certain that defaults exist that are not actually true.
Mm-hmm.
Our district is not a majority white district, for example, and that's what people think a lot of times, and it's like, no, that is absolutely not the case. That's not our largest demographic, and it's not even like some of the schools I went to when I was younger, where if you add all of the more diverse students together, they would equal. No, it's just, that's not the largest demographic. It's one of the largest demographics, but it's not. So our concept of what default is has to change over time, because when you perpetuate a certain default in your mind, you're helping to make it happen. And that's what I think has happened sometimes with RPGs.
Yeah, I believe that it's not even just like making the space more welcoming to people from diverse backgrounds. It's also making it so that the dominant culture can see other people, a dominant culture, I don't even like that term, but see other people as being normal, valid, heroic, whatever it is. So how can we make space for a diverse range of players?
I think one of the most important things is going to be to listen to your players that are from marginalized communities and give up control when they're talking. Like, if you have it set in your head, no, this is exactly how this thing should work, and somebody is from a culture that is much more relevant to that, you're not the expert. Just back off, listen to them. Don't make your idea that is so prominent in your mind become more important than the lived experience of the people at your table.
There are a lot of people out there who associate D&D with the European Middle Ages. It's not even close, but there are a lot of people who are like, they have that stuck in their head. And as a result, they get very upset when somebody tries to do something a little different. When you have players coming to your game, listen to them, find out what they want to explore, what do they want to play, and figure out a way to work that into the game. You know, it's like whatever world your characters are in is vast. There can be other cultures there. Work with the other players. If you have a specific setting, see if there are options, then work with your players to find out if they're interested in any of that. Or even just allow variety. People sometimes they just want to play something weird. They just want to play something unusual. Leave space to find out what your players want to play. And I'm not saying diverse cultures, people from diverse backgrounds are weird. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that there's more space to explore different character options in D&D today than ever were available. I see so many grognards out there bitching about people are playing these weird creatures and races and stuff, and we never had that back in my day. It's like, no, we didn't, because you guys were sticks in the mud and wouldn't allow it. If I want to play a Harengon, I want to play a Harengon, man.
And I think that actually brings up a good point that, when you say the thing about, playing something weird, we're not talking about like an actual culture or a marginalized identity, but sometimes those things that are outside the norm are symbolic for people. And I will throw this out there as far as like my general neurotype. I never really understood how much it occurred to me that I don't see that as much until I was watching the She-Ra series and I saw Entrapta in there. I am not a woman, and I am not a woman whose hair is prehensile, but there were just things about that character that I loved so much and felt good for me to see in that character. And those are the things you don't always know because you're not in someone else's head.
This is a slight tangent, but you've heard of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. It's basically the concept is that these fictional characters actually exist in the world and they banded together to go on missions and do stuff. And the concept has sometimes been taken and tried to be transported into more recent decades, like the Extraordinary Gentlemen of the 1980s or the 1990s. I was part of a conversation once where they were trying to come up with characters, and it was a whole bunch of white action hero guys. And I was like, this is a pretty boring list. I think they were able to bring in Eddie Murphy from Beverly Hills Cop, but there were no women because they didn't want to bring in Ripley because that's a science fiction movie. That doesn't fit. And, it was like having that conversation with those guys, they kind of realized, wow, it was pretty homogenous, wasn't it? So you start to, if you look back at that type of thing, you start to see how limited the scope of what was considered heroic was in previous years of media. So it is nice to see more options today, and it's our tables. We should be able to do whatever we want at our tables as far as that goes.
Yeah, definitely.
So what do we need to keep in mind when we want to see ourselves in our heroes and we want to see the heroism in people other than ourselves? We kind of started to touch on this a little bit. But...
Yeah, and we were discussing that a little bit with what you were just saying, but I think to make it a little bit more evident what we're talking about there was a thing, and part of this problem in the 80s is that when you did have representation, when you did have a black character or a gay character, it was the best friend. See, we have representation. The problem is you need to have those characters mean something. They can't be the side character. They can't be the supporting character. They need to be important people in the setting as well. You don't just want to say, look over there, there's representation. Now back to the real game.
It's a bit of a fluke that we got a strong female character out of Terminator. Because when Terminator came out, Linda Hamilton's character, Sarah Connor, she was just your typical woman in an action movie needing to be rescued and all that. And then they twisted it kind of on its head when Terminator 2 came out and she was like, no, I'm going to protect my son. Chunk, chunk. Like that moment where she's walking down the hallway with, her one arm hurt, but her other arm has her shotgun and she just cocks it just like that. I'm like, oh my God, so badass. But that was so rare to see that happen. There were plenty of women in action movies in the 80s and early 90s, but most of them were set dressing. They were a reward for the hero. They were the plot catalyst. They did not have agency of themselves to do anything. And like Jared said, yeah, there were ethnic black or ethnic other characters in these movies, but they really were just, look, we had one. We had representation there, and it's just like, that doesn't really work.
Yeah. It's also interesting. One of the big things that emerged in the 80s was the final girl in horror movies. One of the things that I think is really important when you look at something like A Nightmare on Elm Street is Nancy fought back. Nancy planned on how to take Freddy out. It wasn't just that she was the last one to survive or that her boyfriend saved her from getting killed and sacrificed himself. Nancy figured out the rules of how this dream thing worked and fought back. And that is the type of thing that you want to keep in mind when you are including characters in your stories.
Yeah. The Bechdel test is a little bit controversial sometimes because it's not the best rule, and some people treat it as like the only rule for representation of women in media. It wasn't meant to be that. So what the Bechdel test is, are there two women in whatever piece of property this is that have a conversation together that does not involve the men of the piece? And if your movie passes that, yay, it passes the Bechdel test. It has some feminine representation in it. I don't always abide by that because there's some really great things out there that don't pass the test. But at the same time, it's really worth considering. Like, does this piece have female characters or black characters or queer characters or whatever who have lives outside of their relationship to the main male character?
The thing that I have definitely been noticing in sci-fi, horror, fantasy in much more recent times is there are now a lot of romances that are queer romances. And the thing that has really been driven home to me watching some of these things is a good romance affects you the same way. It may not be the kind of person that you would have a romance with, but that connection between those characters and seeing that relationship and what it means to the story is going to affect you because they are human beings that have feelings for each other.
I believe I've told this story on this podcast before, but I put together a D&D game to run at Gen Con in 2017 that had a relatively diverse cast of PCs for the people to play. Each of the characters kind of had secrets that were supposed to kind of come out during play. Two of them were gay lovers who had a forbidden romance of sorts. One was a prince of the realm, and the other was a relatively high-ranking cleric in the church. They weren't supposed to be together. And then things happen, and that prince now becomes the heir. There's questions of who's he going to marry to carry on the family line, yada, yada. You know, like typical fantasy tropes and stuff like that. So on their character sheets, it says they had a secret love affair, and they had separated because of everything that was going on. And now the two of them are sent together on this mission with everyone else. When I ran this at Gen Con, I had a table of 5 guys that all looked like they were college age and were all friends, and 1 woman. And the 2 guys who got the characters that were secret lovers, like one of them is reading his backstory and he pauses and he's like, "Hey dude, who's playing so-and-so?" And one of his friends holds his hand up. He's like, "Have you read your background?" "No, I've been looking at my character abilities." "Read your background. It's important." And I was like, oh God, is this going to be weird? Are they going to be weird about this? They were a little weird at the beginning, you know, doing like cutesy eye things at each other and all that. But then once they got into the game, once things started rolling, by the end of it, they were invested. They were absolutely positively invested and trying to make sure that those 2 characters could end up together at the end of it all. And it was so lovely, you know, so lovely to see that happen. You know, and it's like, it's that type of romance. It's like, if you have empathy for other people, it doesn't need to be exactly the same thing that you are into for you to feel some of the emotions for how it goes.
Yeah.
What should we keep in mind when it comes to world building when we want to have diversity and representation in our game worlds?
The thing that I think of when we talk about this is Chris Claremont apparently had a thing that he would do back when he was writing for Marvel in the 80s. Whenever someone started talking about a character, he would say, but what if they were a woman? And that's part of why we actually had so many strong women in the X-Men, because he was willing to say, they don't need to be a guy. We can expand this. I think we need to keep that in mind, not just what if they were a woman, but for a wide range of other people. Like, this is going to be a great, awesome character, but what if they were queer? You know, what if they weren't of the same ethnicity as the rest of this area where the people are at? Keeping that in mind and asking that question and being willing to follow it through to its ending.
A lot of times what I will do is I will think about what is the assumed default. Like, the halfling blacksmith. He was from the Gear District. It's a dwarven district. Everyone's going to assume you're going to find a dwarf blacksmith. I could have totally done that, but what's going to be interesting? What's going to be unique? What's going to stand out a little bit and catch the attention of my players? I'm going to make a beefy halfling. I've done this a lot when I will think about what is the default and then what can be different. And I am very much a proponent of, it's a fantasy world. I'm not going to assign real world ethnic segregation to my fantasy world. You know, like, I will generally have people of all colors and stripes in my setting just there. You know, this is the world they live in. Just because I can. I don't have to be one of those people who's like, no, it's a Eurocentric setting, so all of the people should look this way.
That's actually one of the things I really like about the product line, the Thrones and Bones setting, is it has amazing artwork. But that's one of the things that I like is, even though this is a very Norse folklore type setting, you will often see, like, okay, there's a blonde character, there's a redheaded character, there's a blonde character. Oh, this is a dark-skinned person that is also part of this town. And a lot of that is not so much that the world just assumes that people randomly have whatever skin color, but it is the fact that this is a seafaring culture with merchants, and people live in different parts of the world and then come to different parts of the world and settle there. So there are families that don't necessarily look like the people that lived here 100 years ago. And I really appreciate that, because it would be very easy to default to everyone being white and blonde or red-haired or brunettes, and that's
everyone looking like Chris Hemsworth.
Yeah, that's the only diversity you have in this entire area.
And I mean, this is all going to depend upon the game you're running, because if you are running a game that is meant to be using a specific culture, specific setting, you know, then your mileage may vary on some of this, but it is still worth having these thoughts. Is there any reason this couple that the PCs run across should be a man and a woman? Why can't it be two women? You know, like, why can't you do that? It's okay to just think about what the default is and then change it. Just a little. How does diverse world building benefit the campaign outside of respect for other human beings?
Yeah, that was really the crux of this question from our listener, is it's not just that you should do this because it's the right thing to do and you should make things accommodating to other people. It's that there are actual benefits to making things more diverse. When you include more cultures and more perspectives and more people who aren't like you, you have more to draw from. The more you have to draw from, the more rich and textured the things that you're creating are going to be.
Yeah, it's... You go. Do the next one.
The thing that's really important is even that diversity that you're building in to make people feel more welcome, that is a benefit to the game, because when people are invested and engaged in the campaign, they're going to contribute more to it. So when they see themselves there, they are going to be able to latch onto more things and to feel comfortable and to feel like, I'm not just participating, but I have an equal say in what this looks like and what this feels like.
I think it gives your players more of a permission to suggest or add their ideas to the game. Oh, it's, you know, you've got this wide array of people and ethnicities and ideas and so on. it's like, it's okay for my character to now be this, that they might hold back on if they're expecting your typical fantasy D&D game from 40 years ago.
I mean, we just mentioned Chris Claremont and the X-Men, but like, it is painfully obvious that the all-new X-Men from the 70s, that was a much better version of the X-Men, because that's what resonated and became like the best-selling comic book in the world at that point in time, because it wasn't a handful of white kids with one girl. It was now people from all around the world with different backgrounds and different ethnicities and different points of view. That was an objectively better storyline because of it.
The original X-Men had interesting ideas. The characters weren't bad. They had interesting ideas. But when you look at the core kind of ideas, that it was like echoing a lot of the civil rights movement, but then all of the characters are pretty much cut from the same cloth.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, yeah, this is a neat idea, but it's not resonating the same as it is when all of a sudden it's rebooted in the 70s and you have a way wider diverse group of characters. It didn't get rid of the original team. It just added more context and more depth.
Yeah, it's really interesting because they really were kind of like feeling the waters and like, how blatant can we be about the civil rights movement? We're going to have all white kids that are a marginalized community that we just made up, so that we're kind of, it's like putting the medicine in the dog food. Like, you don't realize you're actually getting a cultural message that you should be hearing, but you are.
And to be fair to the writers of the original run of the X-Men, they didn't even have, I don't think Black Panther was added to the Marvel line until, what was it, 69?
Yeah.
70?
Well, I think it was still in the 60s, but I mean, Black Panther was a big deal, but I mean, that was like, we need to make sure we have our sales and all of our core stuff like Spider-Man and Daredevil and Fantastic Four and Hulk. That stuff is now all selling really well. Yeah. Now we're going to introduce this character in Fantastic Four. Again, too, they didn't just start a Black Panther comic. They introduced him in Fantastic Four. These were things that they were building on, because the 60s were not, the time that we're living in now. Although, unfortunately, we have people trying to make our time as regressive as things might have been.
Yeah.
I won't go off on that tangent for too long, but it is interesting to see that building on top of things.
So what do we need to keep in mind regarding cultural respect when we are trying to add this diversity to our games?
The danger is exactly what you were talking about with the first edition Oriental Adventures. We're going to make things more diverse, and I am now an expert. Me, as a white man, I have read a book on Japan, so I now know everything there is to know about samurai. Don't do that.
Do your research.
Yes.
Do actual looking up stuff and all that. But look it up from people from that culture. Don't just go to Wikipedia and read what's there. Look up some people from that culture and what they say about their culture.
Yes. Ideally, if you have someone from that background in your game, talk to them about these things and make sure that you're not introducing things that you didn't understand are a problem. The other thing that I would say is sometimes, like we were saying, when you include something, go slow. And what I mean by that is not that you should be worried about being too diverse. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about make sure that the people in your game know that there are people that look like the people from Middle Eastern or Northern African cultures, that there are people that look like they could be from East Asian cultures, but don't necessarily throw everything about that culture out there as if it is definitive, because you don't know what to do there.
Yeah.
There is a way to start introducing those concepts without portraying yourself as being an expert, or without showing that those cultures and how you're going to use them are set in stone.
And one of the things, too, especially if you're world building from scratch, you don't need to detail every square inch of your world with what culture lives where, what culture would do. You can have broad strokes, still have diverse characters in this world, places for them, but you can leave space for this stuff to develop later in your campaign. Or if you have a player who's suddenly interested in having a character from that region, and you can basically work with them on filling in some of the details. You don't, because that's trying to put too much in on a broad scale is where you can start making some insensitive mistakes.
It's honestly one of the things that I think TSR started making a mistake with the Forgotten Realms in a lot of places, because not saying that Ed Greenwood was perfect in his world building at all, but in a lot of places he would have a culture that sort of looked like this culture, but it wasn't that culture, and it had this fantasy element tied to it as well. He wasn't necessarily saying, here is France in the Forgotten Realms, here is Persia in the Forgotten Realms. Even like Kalimshan, which a lot of people think of as being that very standard tropey Middle Eastern, really wasn't. There were elements of like the Roman Empire in there, and like magocracies. What TSR started doing was literally stapling on, here is the fantasy version of the Mongolian culture, here is the fantasy version of Aztecs, and it's like, no.
Yeah, don't do that. One thing too is like, when we say do research, and as Jared said, if you know somebody, talk to them. Many marginalized communities have been conditioned to keep quiet, even when they're seeing something they're not comfortable with, when they see something that is harmful. So go out of your way to ask for input and collaborate, because they are so used to the background noise of this stuff that sometimes they won't speak up. I always think this is not related to ethnic cultures or anything like that, but there is a cartoon from, I think it's Short Packed, from many, many years ago at this point, where a guy that was the stand-in typical nerd guy was like, well, all of the guys in comics are drawn for the woman's perspective. They're all hot and muscly. And she's, no, Batman is drawn for your power fantasy. Batman is not drawn for me. If Batman were drawn for me, he would look like this. And she proceeds to draw the expressive eyes, the sensual lips, the lithe body, all of this. And he's looking at going, that makes me uncomfortable. And she's like, welcome to the background noise of my life.
Also, look at how Nicola Scott draws Nightwing. But
Nightwing.
Yeah, it is interesting, because I have heard Black players in a game, when someone asks them, hey, what did you think of this? And they'll say, that was actually terrible. And they'll say, and the person asking them will be like, why didn't you say this to me before? And they're like, because I was enjoying the game. That was one terrible part, and I wasn't going to put you on the spot. But if you're asking me, I'm going to tell you that was terrible.
Yeah. What should we keep in mind about our default assumptions when we're making NPCs? What are the benefits of diversifying your NPCs beyond just being respectful and reflecting the type of people that play the game?
One of the things that you can fall into very easily is, I am making this more diverse, so now I'm going to make this person from this marginalized community into a villain, and they're very important to the campaign, and they're very deep, and they have a lot of things going on. But they're also a villain, and also maybe that plays into a certain stereotype that often gets associated with that particular type of marginalized community.
Yeah, be careful of that.
And I'm not saying never do it. I'm saying that it's a thing you have to be aware of.
Yeah, be careful with that. Understand some of the real world tropes that go along with some of these cultures and the way they have been portrayed in media, because that can be a problem. It's like, if you have an understanding of how they have been portrayed harmfully in the past, you can try and avoid that with your NPCs. Earlier, when I said, change things, figure out what the default is and change it, a lot of that I was talking about for NPCs in the game. Because I can't control who my players play, but I can control the people in the world they're interacting with.
Yeah, I just thinking of a character from media that I love that falls straight into this. And I love this character, actually, and how they were played, but they're also a problem because of the time and how everything happened. The Mirror Universe version of Kira in Deep Space Nine. falls into that whole, she was, bisexual or pansexual and wanted to sleep with every single person she met all the time, constantly. Because she could be attracted to different genders, she was attracted to everyone all the time, everywhere. That is a big issue that a lot of people that are bi or pan have to deal with, that people assume about them. And that is exactly what they did with this villain, when they introduced the Mirror Universe version of Kira. And the reason that was even worse is because this is the point in time when Rick Berman was not letting you have positive representation of queer people. So therefore, when they finally get to portray someone, it's like the old Hays Code. It's, she has to be evil and bad and terrible and show up all these tropes. I loved how Nana Visitor played that character. She was great. She was vamping it up. It was so different than how she played the regular universe version of her. But the fact that you couldn't have good representation on that show, so this is the only representation you got.
I'm going to take a moment and tangent into talking about the Hays Code. The Hays Code was the guidelines for what content was allowed to be in movies from about 1930-something until the late 60s. It is not actually that long of a period of time, but it was what we consider the quote-unquote golden age of Hollywood. And the rules for that period were, A, no villain, no bad guy, no person was allowed to commit a crime on screen and not be punished by the end of the movie. So if somebody committed a murder, even if it was in self-defense, they needed to be punished by the end of the movie. In addition to this, anyone who was queer had to be a bad guy. You were not allowed to have positive queer representation in these movies. And it was like, not allowed. And if they were a bad guy, they had to suffer some sort of bad ending by the end of the movie. This was the Hays Code. So the Hays Code lasted up until the late 60s. I don't remember the exact date it came down, but it was at that end of 60s, early 70s, where they switched to the rating system that we know now. PG, R, G, so on and so forth. And they did away with those rules. And we have honestly been using the system we know today for almost twice as long as the Hays Code was in existence. But the Hays Code was so dominant that it has taken a very long time for entertainment to start moving away from some of those ideals that had to be instilled, where if somebody commits a crime, they need to be punished. If somebody's queer, they're not allowed to be a good guy. As a result, there were a lot of queer characters that were basically bad guys in a lot of the entertainment we had up until people started moving away from it and started doing more positive representation. Some of it started happening in the 70s, but then the Reagan era happened and, but we started to get more in the 90s and the 2000s.
And a lot of the Hays Code is also what got adapted into the Comics Code Authority when that was adopted. If you hear similar things, it's because that was kind of the model for that, what they adopted there. The other thing that I think is worth pointing out is that it should probably be stated that there was actually more diverse content when it came to like romances and who was attracted to who in movies before the Hays Code. In other words, it's not that everyone thought this and nobody would go see those movies. It's that somebody got concerned and decided to enforce on everyone that this must be what's true.
Yeah, it is. If you are interested even remotely, I highly recommend looking up some information about Hollywood pre-Hays Code. They did some wild stuff on film back in the day. But there has always been a back and forth in the United States for as long as the United States has existed between progressive ideas and conservative ideas. And a lot of times those conservative ideas come out on top and affect society for a period of time. That was the Hays Code. That was the rise of the moral minority in the 80s, so on and so forth. And I don't want to get too far into it, but it's something to be aware of with the entertainment we have in our lives and our history that informs the games we bring to our tables.
Yeah. I will just throw out there, if you look at, like, for example, sitcoms in the late 70s and early 80s versus all of a sudden, at a certain point in the 80s, there were topics and people that were not included anymore suddenly, not as a natural thing.
I highly recommend, hey, look, Ange is recommending a YouTube channel. I highly recommend looking up Matt Baum, Baume, on YouTube. He does a lot of historical looks back at queer representation in media. And he looks at a lot of what was going on in the sitcoms of the late 60s, early 70s, and how that changed when Reagan was elected in 1980. And then how it slowly started changing again in the 90s into the 2000s.
Yeah.
It's fascinating stuff. And it is a great way to get a look at kind of queer representation. I once had a conversation with my niece, who is gay, and we were talking about fan fiction. And I was, in my straight hetero self, was having kind of a complaint about how so many slash fics take perfectly lovely friendships and turn them into romance. It's like, why can't we just have good friendships? And she's like, because those of us who don't have representation need to sometimes make it ourselves. When you can't see yourself represented in your entertainment, sometimes you take a little fan fiction route and make that representation.
And now I will throw out a YouTube channel. If you look up Savvy Writes Books, she has an episode on the fan fiction shipping of Kirk and Spock. And she does a very deep dive, and it is not as not supported as you would think it is, even based on things that Gene Roddenberry said.
So how can we work with our players to create a more diverse game world for our campaigns?
Ask for input, but also don't expect that your players are going to go out of their way to do work for you. And what I mean by work is don't expect somebody to spend the emotional energy that it takes to explain what it is like to be a marginalized person. It's not their job necessarily to explain to you all the ways that the world has kicked them when they're down, but ask them for input and listen to them and take what they give you.
I think that's the key there, is listen to them and actually take their input on what is being added to the world. I'm already a strong advocate for take what your players want to play and find a way to put that into your world. That can be for everything as they want to play a queer character from a certain culture that is now in your world, to I want to play a changeling and I didn't have changelings in the world before.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it can be any aspect of that. You should be talking to your players, listening to your players, and finding ways to work to putting that stuff into the world with them. So what do we need to keep in mind when we're making pre-gens for one-shots or campaigns that we're going to be running?
I think one of the biggest things that I have learned in recent years is it is awesome for you to include, as like you were talking about, you know, making sure you have the characters that have that connection, but don't get too invested in how those connections play out, because then you could be shutting down other forms of representation. You can have a romantic couple that is demisexual. They are only attracted to each other because they know each other and they've become friends and that they have grown that connection between each other. If you have it in your head how this romance should be expressed, you might be shutting down somebody that wants to tell that story because it's meaningful to them.
There are different philosophies about pre-gen characters, especially for one-shots. You guys all know I go to a lot of cons. I think about this stuff a lot. And there are different philosophies. There are people who bring a character to a game and they will have both a male and a female version of that character.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who will bring a character to a game that has no name, no gender, no personal details, and they allow the players to fill in the details. There are people who will bring fully fleshed out characters to the table. I go back and forth on which ones I like to play with, and the reason I don't always do the let the players create the character is because I want to push some boundaries and I want to make people play characters that they might not have otherwise considered playing.
I think what's interesting about that too is like back before the massive gulf between when I went to conventions and now, I had started running a lot of PBTA games and I wasn't bringing pre-generated characters. And in that case, you are really counting on the people at the table to add that diversity in. Now, thankfully, a byproduct of running PBTA games at a convention that was founded by a bunch of people that are like old grognards playing miniatures games from the 70s is that when someone signs up for a PBTA game, they are often people that desperately want the experience and are very much invested in making a more diverse story at the table.
I spent years going to conventions, and I would show up to a table, and the only characters available were all white dudes. And like, okay, fine, whatever. I'm here to play the game. I'll play the character that's in front of me. It didn't necessarily mean the game was bad, but I saw that lack of representation. I saw that kind of homogeneousness of the characters. And so when I started running for cons, I wanted to have diversity. Now, I've not always been perfect. I found the characters I made for a Teen Supers game that I was running back around 2008, 2009, and I am embarrassed by those characters. But I was trying, and I think I've learned since then. I want to bring characters to the table that maybe push people a little out of their comfort zone. A little tiny bit, just a little bit. Because I want people to see other people in their heroes, not just themselves, or not just people like them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to touch on is there are some really tricky instances of inclusivity that that surround things like trying to portray neurodivergent characters or people that have certain mental illnesses, because it is really easy to fall into, okay, I looked this up in the DSM-4 and someone that has this type of mental illness usually has these issues. Don't do that. Like, it is hard to make the space for someone that has a difference in their neurology or in their behavior, and you should make room for that, but don't try and prescribe it, because that is more harmful than if you didn't mention anything at all.
I'm also going to add here, if you do bring diverse characters to your table, whether they're different ethnicities, they're people of color, whether they are queer characters, whether they're neurodivergent characters, whatever, if you have a player that starts being offensive with the way they're playing that character, shut that down. I know it's hard. I know it is hard to step in and say, hey, that's not cool. But if your goal is to help bring diversity to the table, you have to stop that when they're being offensive. There's an incident from quite a few years back where it was an Indiana Jones style game with pulpy characters from the 30s. And one of the characters was Chinese. And the guy who played him, the accent he was using was really offensive. And I was like, I still regret that I didn't stop and say, hey, I am not comfortable with the way you are playing this character. Yeah. It's offensive. If somebody's going down that route, stop them. It's just, don't let somebody be offensive with the stereotypes, the way they're playing a character at your table.
And I will even throw this in here. They could be in full George Lucas mode, where they aren't even thinking that is an offensive thing, even though it's painfully obvious to most people that it is, because just look at several accents that George Lucas included in the prequel trilogies. I don't think George Lucas is a mean-spirited person in the least, but he grew up watching those movie serials, and he isn't thinking this is offensive to someone. He's thinking this is the accent that a Japanese villain has in these things.
Yeah. Anyway, let's start getting out of here. What are our biggest takeaways on why diversity is beneficial to our campaigns and how it can make them better?
You know, when you were in school and you had to have crayons and you wanted the crayons that were like the 64 box one and not just the 12 that was probably the bare minimum that you could have, more crayons is better. Having a wider palette to draw from when you create art is better. Having more tropes to pull from in storytelling is better, and that's what diversity brings to all of that.
I want more people to play games. And by making sure our games have space for that diversity and representation, makes more people feel comfortable sitting down at our tables.
Now let's join Ange and Jared for some downtime research, where they do the work so we don't have to.
Every episode, we're going to look for something related to D&D that we want to pass along to our listeners. It might be products, websites, videos, or podcasts, but it will always be something that we think will enhance your D&D experience.
Hey, look! It's Ange recommending another YouTube video. It's like I might spend a lot of time on YouTube. Anyway, Dungeon Dudes recently dropped a video talking about an alternative concept for running minions. Hordes. The concept is rather than having dozens of 1 or 10 HP minions that you still need to roll for individually, treat them like a swarm. They go into details on it, and I really want to give this a try. I actually thought about possibly trying to do it with the fight at the tower if they decided to do a frontal assault with the 30 goblinoids that are in front of it, but I didn't have time with everything else I was doing to pull that together, but I love this concept.
I've been very, I fell into, watching more and more of their videos, and I do really enjoy a lot of their content. Even if I don't 100% agree with them, they bring up a lot of neat stuff to think about to help you reframe how you're going to do things.
Yeah, I like them a lot.
So my recommendation is kind of weird. I felt like 2 years ago when this adventure came out, and it's weird that it was that long ago now, because it feels like it was last year, but time has no meaning. But when Vecna Eve of Ruin came out, I was on multiple podcasts and wrote multiple blog posts about how this adventure vexes me, because it's just it's a good concept and horribly executed in some places and just weird decisions made. And this even gets weirder than I thought it was going to be when I first went to suggest this, because Polygon has an interview with Chris Perkins about his original plan for Vecna Eve of Ruin. And really, when they specifically quote Chris, most of what he was saying was they had an outline. The final adventure didn't follow that outline. He was going to be in charge of it, but they pulled him back to work on the core books instead of the adventure. So things deviated a lot from that original outline. Then the Polygon article proceeds to talk about how this was going to, revolve around the obelisks and going back in time to the Netherese Empire to confront Vecna. That may not have been what Chris Perkins said. It may have been them reading the end of Rime of the Frost Maiden and extrapolating. And it is a very fascinating bit of game journalism that game journalism often says whatever the hell it wants to and just assumes we're talking about games. So who cares if we're extrapolating things and putting words in people's mouths? And the way that we get to the idea that maybe they were extrapolating is that Ray Winninger, who was in charge of D&D at the time that the outline was drawn up for Eve of Ruin, came out and said, no, as when I was still there, which was not by the end of, the adventure's final steps, but when he was there, that outline had nothing to do with going back in time and fighting Vecna in the Netherese Empire. It was always about jumping to different realities of D&D, but the ending was supposed to be fighting Vecna in underneath Castle. That's Grayskull. The adventure was supposed to be this big culmination where they fight Vecna underneath Castle Greyhawk, and it was really meant to be like that bookend of, this is where some of the first dungeons ever happened in Dungeons and Dragons, and now 50 years later you're going to face Vecna here. It makes a lot more sense than fighting him in Netheril, since he's not a Forgotten Realms character. But it's fascinating that, and Ray even said, things obviously deviated from that outline, but not as much as they were kind of implying that they deviated in the interview they did with Chris Perkins. I just think it's fascinating. So I'm going to share out the link for the Polygon article and Ray Winninger's posts on Blue Sky, just because this is a fascinating look at how game journalism seems to work and how much maybe work we need to do about making game journalism a little bit better.
We are happily part of the Polygamers Podcast Network, helping you run and play your best games. We think you'll enjoy another Polygamers podcast like
Under the Lamplight. Under the Lamplight is the Streets of Avalon RPG companion podcast where Brett and Chris talk about the setting and the game. The Streets of Avalon RPG is a low fantasy urban RPG focused on the stories of people living in a city of classism, corruption, and decay while trying to bring a little light into their lives and the people closest to them.
We've used up all of our resources, so I think it's time for a long rest. I hope this adventure was rewarding for you. We hope you go exploring with us when we start our next adventure.